Okay, so welcome everyone to the London Buddhist Centre, to the main shrine room of the London Buddhist Centre in the East End of London. My name is Maitreyabandhu. I'm the founder of PoetryEast. PoetryEast is an event that happens at the London Buddhist Centre. We've been running for about 10 years now. And what the ideal of PoetryEast is to interview the best writers and artists about the significance of their work, the human significance of their work. Sometimes we say the spiritual significance of their work, but personally, I'm not very sure about that word spiritual anymore. I don't know what it means. What I mean by it is the human value of it, the personal value of their work. So I've interviewed artists like Anthony Gormley, the sculptor Anthony Gormley. I've interviewed poets like Jory Graham. I've interviewed Colm Tóibín, the Irish novelist, and today I'm going to be interviewing Sigrid Nunez, live in New York. She's in New York. We've already made contact, so I know that she's in her apartment. I think it's just near Union Square, but she can correct me. I've only been to New York once. I have a very approximate sense of New York, but I think that's where she'll be, in her apartment near Union Square in New York. And we're going to be talking about her book, The Friend, which won the National Book Award. I'll introduce her properly in a moment. I want to say a little tiny bit about why we have PoetryEast here at the London Buddhist Centre. And recently I was reading and rereading the Dyers Hand, a famous book of prose by W.H. Auden, the English poet. And in it, he says that the primary function of poetry, as of all the arts, is to make us more aware of ourselves and the world around us. That the primary function of poetry, as of all the arts, is to make us more aware of ourselves and the world around us. So if we were to think of that as the definition of poetry and all of the arts, including literature, obviously, then that crosses over fundamentally with the project of Buddhism, to make us more aware of ourselves and the world around us. You could say perhaps that the only real difference is that Buddhism's vision of being more aware extends far beyond what we can imagine. It extends all the way up to a state of consciousness that's embodied by this figure behind me of the Buddha, that the human awareness, and particularly human imagination, has no limit to it, has no end to it. And that limitless nature of the human imagination can take us to a consciousness that is embodied by this figure behind me. I'm a great fan of the poet Wallace Stevens, the great American poet Wallace Stevens, and he says how high that highest candle lights the dark. How high human consciousness can light the dark, just incredible what human consciousness is capable of, but also we know how dangerous human consciousness is as well. Some of the worst atrocities that we've seen in the world are to do with ideas in people's minds, and the infectious nature of ideas in people's minds. So that gives you a little bit of a clue why the London Buddhist Centre hosts arts events, why I've been interviewing Wendy Cope, Michael Longley, and so many other poets and writers and artists here at the London Buddhist Centre. So what we usually do at PoetryEast is we usually start with a very brief meditation, then I ask the guest to have two pieces of writing read by people who've influenced their work. But we want to keep this quite a tight event, so we're just going to go for about an hour. So we're going to start with Vishvantra, a member of the Triratna Buddhist order like myself. That you can tell that because we're wearing these cases. She's going to read two short excerpts from Sigrid Nunez's book, The Friend. So let's just go over to her first, just to start this.
Everyone I know is writing a book, the therapist tells me unnecessarily. I meet a lot of writers, and I can tell you, writer's block is pretty common. But I'm not there to talk about writer's block. If I weren't so anxious to be on my way, I would explain. Usually, when a writer sees that someone else has just published a big piece in a major publication on the very topic they've been working on, they feel dismay. I felt relief. Well, okay then, said the editor, sounding relieved himself. I guess you're off the hook. To draw me out, the therapist asks what I did for the holidays. When I tell him, he says gently, he says everything gently. Sounds like that's one of the ways your loss has affected you, not wanting to be with other people. Hating to be with other people, I don't say. Terrified of being with other people. But the truth is, even if I hadn't been worried about leaving Apollo, I'd have wanted to be alone. Strays is what a writer I recently read calls those who, for one reason or another, and despite whatever they might have wanted earlier in life, never really become a part of life, not in the way most people do. They may have serious relationships. They may have friends, even a sizable circle. They may spend large portions of their time in the company of others. But they never marry and they never have children. On holidays, they join some family or other group. This goes on year after year until they finally find it in themselves to admit that they'd really rather just stay home. But you must see a lot of people like that, I say to the therapist. Actually, he says, I don't. Now I am forced to talk, if nothing else, to explain why I don't want to talk. Still true, I don't want to talk about you or to hear others talk about you. I want to quote Wittgenstein on the unspeakable and the necessity for silence. Even if quoting philosophers out of context was something you told us not to do. Philosophical statements aren't old sayings, you said. A pause here to wonder at Wittgenstein, 3 of whose 4 brothers killed themselves, and who often thought about killing himself too. Who, like Kafka, is said to have received the news of his terminal illness with relief, but whose words at the actual hour of death bring to mind George Bailey. Tell them I've had a wonderful life. Do I talk to Apollo? The shrink asks. Well, yes. To encourage bonding, it is recommended that people talk to their dogs, which seems to come naturally, though my guess is people are now doing it less and less thanks to our attention-devouring devices. I once heard a stranger in agitated conversation with her pug. And I suppose it's all my fault again, isn't it? At which, I swear, the dog rolled its eyes.
That's great. Thank you very much, Viswanto. Really, really good. Really lovely to hear 2 short sections from Sigrid Nunez's book, The Friend. What I didn't say before is that Apollo is a Great Dane. You can see that's a dog, the Great Dane. it's actually the only character that's actually named in Sigrid's novel. So I want to introduce her to you, or rather I want to introduce how we've come to do this interview. So I was, a friend of mine gave me this book, The Friend, and it came to me at that one of those moments when, you know, there's serendipitous moments where, for me, I wasn't reading anything at the time, didn't have a novel. I'd ordered a book to read, but I hadn't got it because, you know, things take so long to arrive now with this COVID situation that we're all in, the difficult situation we're all in. But this friend of mine gave me this book, and I hadn't, I'm afraid, heard of Sigrid Nunez before. I'd not heard of her, so I wasn't sure what to make of it. You know, for me, reading a novel is a serious thing. I want to really read novels that are worth it, as it were. And I started reading it, and I just felt more and more delighted by it as I read. By the end of it, I felt that feeling that you might have, I hope you've had, and I have from time to time, that sense of gratitude, that sense of personal gratitude, that I feel that I've been given something. I feel that, yeah, I've been given something. I was given the book itself as a literal gift just before COVID closed down. It seems like closed down the world and cancelled the future. It seems like what it did, and is still doing in many ways. And in that first few days and weeks, at that difficult time, it was lovely to have such good company. I mean, actually, I live in a Buddhist community with 10 others, but every night in my bedtime reading Sigrid's book, I felt in really, really good company. I felt that I'd met a friend in the book, and I felt I'd been given to. We were on the phone just earlier in the week, and I was saying that the thing that particularly strikes me about the book is its atmosphere of wisdom. And by wisdom, I particularly mean a certain kind of atmosphere in the book. Wisdom isn't an ideology or some bright ideas. It's communicated in a certain atmosphere, which I think is everywhere in the book. It's for those of you who haven't read it yet, and I hope everyone will have read it by the end of this, will buy it by the end of this interview. For those of you who haven't read it, it basically starts with a writer's friend who's also a writer, her mentor, committing suicide as an older man and leaving the narrator of the novel with this Harlequin Great Dane to look after. And she lives in a block of flats in which you're not supposed to have dogs. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of the novel, but also a sense of my own gratitude towards Sigrid, because sometimes you feel that, don't you, that a book has spoken to you particularly, has reached across time and space, reached across from New York and sort of shook my hand. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome to the screen, if not to the London Buddhist Centre itself, Sigrid Nunez.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here. And yes, I am in New York. I'm in New York. I'm not that far from Union Square, as you said.
Ah, good. I'm glad I got that right. I hear you've been living there since the 1980s. Is that right? The same apartment?
Yes, I've had the same apartment for a long time, since the mid-80s, though I haven't always been living here. You know, sometimes if I have a teaching job, I'll be off for a semester or two or even longer in some other town. And I've lived abroad a few times, but I have had this for a long time, and I've spent most of my time here since I've had it.
Interesting. So I wanted to start with your name, actually. We discussed this on when we were on the phone, because I was saying Nunez, and my Hippolyte, who's doing the tech for today, he was pronouncing it in the correct Spanish way, and you say, well, there's already a story in your name. So I thought we'd start with your name.
Well, yeah, the name, right? The name reflects my parentage. My mother was German, and my father was half Panamanian and half Chinese, but he was Chinese identified. His first language was Chinese. So neither of my parents use the tilde on the second N, and they neither of them pronounced it in that correct Spanish way. So they always said Nunez, and I too have said Nunez, but very often people will say Nunez, and then I don't really correct them because it is another version of the name, and it doesn't bother me to have either one of those pronunciations.
So I thought it'd be good to say a little bit, Sigrid, about your life. I was interested in just the world you've come into, the world, your parents. I'm struck by the fact that your father's heritage. I thought perhaps say a little bit about the world you came into. Did you, your family a writing family? What kind of world did you come into? What kind of childhood did you have?
Well, my parents were both immigrants. My father was living here as an illegal alien and working in Chinatown, in New York's Chinatown, when World War II broke out, and he was then drafted and ended up fighting in France and Germany and being a part of the occupation of Germany. And that's where he met my mother. Now, I've written a bit. This is the first book I ever wrote, was really about that, about my parents and how they met and my childhood. And then they ended up coming to the States and moved first to a housing project in Brooklyn, the Fort Greene houses, which are still there, and then they moved to another part of New York City, to another borough, to Staten Island, to another housing project, and that's where I was raised until I was 17, and then I moved to Manhattan to go to Barnard College and Columbia, and basically have lived mostly in Manhattan ever since. But neither of my parents had a college education, and the interesting thing about them in my childhood is that they didn't really have a solid common language. I mean, my father's English was never good. And my mother's English, though she had a very heavy accent, it did become quite good, but they didn't really have a shared language the way, let's say, other immigrant parents that I knew of did, who then those parents would speak that language with their children. But in my family, it was a household of broken English. It was always very, at a certain point, it became very interesting to me to try and reflect on how that marriage happened to begin with, because when they met, they didn't have a common language. And then neither one of them wanted to teach their children. There were three of us, three girls. They did not want to teach us their languages. So I didn't learn German or Chinese when I was a child. Nobody spoke Spanish. So that part of my life that has always been so interesting to me, what it's like to grow up in a household where where there isn't really, where everybody is speaking a different language to some extent, or where there's so much like I say, possibility for miscommunication, which there was a lot of. It was a troubled marriage. It was a very troubled marriage. So that's the background. And I did, it was so unusual that, in fact, when I first started to write about it in my first book, A Feather on the Breath of God, I began it with a memory. The book begins, the first time I ever heard my father speak Chinese, it was at Coney Island. And I go on to say, up until then, I hadn't actually believed he was really Chinese. And I mean, a very unusual situation. And then I say, maybe I only half believed it because he was only half Chinese. But I knew very little about my father's family. And everything I knew came from my mother. You know, it was something that I had to write about, my first book. It was something I really wanted to explore. And as I say, that was kind of the first thing I wanted to write about as a writer.
I can imagine. You think that's affected your own sort of attitude towards language yourself and writing? I was wondering when you started writing, when reading and writing. One of the things about The Friend is it's the breadth of your own reading, not just your writing. But when did writing enter your life, and how did it enter your life?
Well, I, like a lot of writers, I wanted to write from an early age. And the reason, it was a very specific reason, which is that I was read to as a child. My mother read to me. She read fairy tales. She read children's books to me. And this was an extremely happy making activity. I loved being read to. It was the magic hour. And then when I learned to read myself, that made me extremely happy. It was, you know, it was what you were saying before. I discovered that books are your friends. They keep you company. They entertain you. They're there when you need them. They take you out of yourself. They are fun. They are serious and fun. So it came very naturally to me to want to write, given that what writers did made people so happy. And in the beginning, I always thought I want to be.
Sigrid, your connection's breaking a bit.
All right.
That's getting
now.
It still seems to be a bit broken up. We'll just see whether we can. Sorry about this. We've got a bit of a connection problem between us and New York. So let's just see how we are. Sigrid, can you hear me? Are you there? Oh. Anything happening?
I'm back here. But now I can hear.
So we're just going to try to work. Ah, there you are. Hello. We've got your connectivity is breaking up for some reason.
Can you?
It's very bad.
Yes, I know. We got completely cut off for a moment, but now I'm back.
Yeah, I can hear you now. That's great.
Not.
Anything else we can do?
Can you hear me now? We seem to have gotten cut off.
What happened there? You seem to disappear.
I know, but now I'm back.
Okay, good. You're back. Let's hope you can stay back. So you were saying about that writing came naturally to you from that being read to, from reading, from books being able to take you away, and so on.
Yes, and so I was saying that that I thought, because I love children's books, my first thought was, when I grow up, I'm going to write children's books myself. But yeah, it was very early on that I wanted to write, that I knew that I wanted to write.
And one of the things that struck me as well is in the Friend, which we'll come to the novel in a moment, but in the Friend, of course, it starts with the suicide of the narrator's mentor. And then I'm struck by your mentors, Susan Sontag and Elizabeth Hardwick. I thought it'd be interesting for you to say a little bit about how you met them and how you experienced them. I know you've written a memoir of Sontag.
Well, I met Elizabeth Hardwick first because she was teaching fiction writing at Barnard College when I was a student there, and I took 2 workshops with her. And she was, in fact, the first professional writer I ever met. She was very, very harsh as a teacher. And she was very impatient with these amateur efforts of students. I really always felt, because I do admire her writing so much, that with her, the influence was greater on me of her writing. For example, Sleepless Nights, her wonderful novel, has been an influence on many things that I've written, including The Friend. So with her, it was less her workshop teaching than her writing, because I actually feel, and I tell my students this, that you learn more from reading other writers' work than you ever will from workshops. I really believe that. And it was through Professor Hardwick that I ended up working at the New York Review of Books as an editorial assistant. And Susan Sontag was a regular contributor there. And I met her in passing there. And then a few years later, when I had finished my MFA program at Columbia, we lived very near each other, we were both living on 106th Street at the time, on the Upper West Side. And she was just recovering from her first bout of cancer and the surgery and the treatment for it. She was about 42 then, I think. And she wanted someone to come and sit and do the typing while she tried to get through her correspondence that had piled up. So I did that for a few hours, a couple of days, and I met her son that way. He was a student at Princeton at the time. And he was living between Princeton and 340 Riverside Drive. And then David and I began dating, and then we were a couple. And then I moved into 340 Riverside Drive with David and Susan. And for about 2 years, I was living there. With Susan, it was a really profound influence on my writing, my thinking, everything. One of the most important things was that from her, I felt that I got a certain kind of permission, which was to take whatever I was writing and my dreams of being a writer very, very seriously, that I had the right to do that even before I'd managed to produce anything good or publish anything. That this idea of seriousness, and not to let other people influence me. For example, at the time, it seemed like everybody else was saying, when are you going to settle down? When are you going to get married? When are you going to get a job that will take care of you? And she just said, don't even think about any of that. She made me feel that it was a perfectly reasonable, even noble thing to do, to make sacrifices for your work and to put it first, to put it ahead of everything, and to be ultra serious about it, and also to be obsessive about it. She would always say, obsessive people make great art. It's a good thing to be obsessive about your work. It's a good thing to care. But she didn't say, she didn't say to be concerned about how much happiness it could bring you. That was really not the concern. The work had its own needs and concerns, and she was very she was fierce about all this as a mentor. And I've always been very grateful for it, because I believe it has really served me very well as a writer.
Yes, indeed. So let's move on to The Friend, to your seventh novel. The first thing I wanted to ask you about it is when you read it, it appears almost to be autofiction. It looks like it reads almost like memoir in some ways, or at least it's difficult in some ways to think of it as a novel, and you even play with the idea of autofiction within it. The narrator of the novel is a writer. She teaches writing. There's lots of references to writing this book and so on. Can you say something about that side of the novel? How autobiographical is it is one question people want to ask, obviously, but that playing with autobiography.
Well, it's interesting because my very first book was a work of autofiction. The book I mentioned that was about my parents and my childhood. The Friend is not autofiction. It's interesting that you say it reads like a memoir, which it does. I sort of think of it as reading as a kind of like a faux memoir or faux autofiction. All these things that happen in the book never happened in real life. Nevertheless, I consider it a very autobiographical book because it has so much of me in it. I mean, I identify with the narrator. I feel that I have a very similar sensibility to the narrator, even if our experiences don't match up. And because I did want part of the book to be about reading and writing and teaching writing, of course, this is what I do and have done for years. So I put a lot of that experience into it. So it's always hard to say how autobiographical a work is, but there are certainly elements of autobiography in all my books, I think. And then this one, as I say, much less than my first book, but it's definitely there. It's definitely something I always want to include in my work, elements from my own life and experience.
And it's interesting, the only named character is the dog, Apollo. The narrator is never named. None of the wives, there's 3 wives, they're all wife 1, wife 2, wife 3. And the addressee of the novel is the narrator's friend. Can you say something of, did you mean that? That only the dog gets to be named?
Well, it's interesting because, a lot of what happens in anything I write is not premeditated. It's something that a decision that comes along while the work is in progress. So it never occurred to me in the beginning to say, I'm going to write this book and only the dog will have a name. I didn't have that as an idea. In fact, not the narrator, but the mentor did have a name. Other characters had names too. And what happened was that as I was writing along and these names were there, they felt, they weighed things down in some way. They felt inauthentic. They felt that they did not belong in there. The narrative wanted something else to happen. The narrative wanted to be disburdened of those names. For whatever reason, I mean, it's not really something I can explain. When I took them out again, things flowed freely. So I was able to write again without feeling that hitch. And this is something I know other writers have also felt about naming characters. And of course, that lack of names then does make it feel even more auto-fictional than it is.
It also gives it a sort of comic turn in some way. There's the balance of comedy and tragedy in the book for me, feel very, very equally balanced. It's at times very funny. It's also, concerned with very, very deep, serious issues. It starts really with talking to a friend that's committed suicide, the narrator addressing him. And it's got this wonderful portrait of the dog. I wonder whether you say about the dog. It's as if Apollo kind of holds so many different elements together.
Well, speaking of Apollo, what I was saying before about names, just the way the human characters seemed not to need or want names, I always thought the dog had to have a name. Um, but the thing with the dog, it's interesting because I did not have the idea of the dog when I started writing this book. I just started writing it. The dog didn't come in for many pages. There's a certain point after a memorial service for the mentor who's committed suicide where she visits with wife 3, who has said, I would like to talk to you, come have coffee with me. And so I'd gotten to that part of the book, and then I had to ask myself, well, and so now what? Where should the story go? What does this woman want from this other woman? And that's where the idea for the dog came in. I think there is something, you put a dog into a story, you do lighten the story to some extent. You put a giant dog that, that um, like Apollo into the story, into the tiny apartment of this woman, an apartment where no dogs are allowed, and her having to cope with it and deal with it. A dog that doesn't really want to be with her at first. Then you do have a situation that's rich with comedy. And that most of the comedy, I think, comes from having the dog as a character. And the two of them, they become almost like a couple themselves.
Do. And another thing I was feeling about the book is that there's so many, that the book touches on so many different areas. It's amazingly broad. Like you mentioned Rilke, you talk about Ackerby's, my dog Tulip, you talk about Edna O'Brien. There's all these lovely stories about teaching students. There's the sort of the streets of New York. It wants to reach out in lots of different directions, but it feels very, very unified in the voice of the narrator and around the symbol of the dog. Did you mean to want to sort of touch on so many different areas? Some very tragic areas. Like you start with people losing their sight, don't you? Because they're in such dreadful situations.
Well, the way the book came about was that it was time. I teach in the creative writing department in the graduate program at Boston University. And every spring we have a faculty reading. And so it was the time coming up to that faculty reading, and there are several of us, so we are asked to keep our reading down to, under 10 minutes. So I wanted to read something new, and I didn't really have anything. So I just started to write. And what I ended up writing was pretty much what turned out to be the first 10 minutes of The Friend. I didn't know where it was going to go. But I wrote those few pages, and I liked the response I got at the reading. And I knew then that I was going to have to read at the University of Maryland in another couple of weeks, and they wanted a 25-minute reading. So I kept writing. So, and by the time I'd gotten there, I knew that I had a book, something that could be a book. But as for the subject matter, what was going on in my mind at that time, there were these several things. One was that I had become aware that several people I know were having thoughts about suicide. They weren't crying for help, they weren't making preparations, but they had gotten it in. This might be how in future, whenever it might happen, how they would leave this life, that's how their story would end. And in fact, I had finished the book when one of these people did commit suicide. And he was one of the people I was thinking of. And then I'd always wanted to write a book that had a main character that was an animal, particularly a dog. So there was that thread. And then, as I said before, I'd spent so much of my life reading and writing and teaching writing and I thought I would love to have a place to write about that. And then finally, right before I started writing The Friend, I had wanted to write a book about um, sex trafficked women. And I made a little bit of a beginning, and I did a certain amount of research, and I realized that I did not have it in me. I could not spend 2 years immersed in that. I couldn't do it. I quailed and I bailed. I did not want to write that book. But it was still in my mind and it was important to me. And I thought there could be a place in The Friend for that too. So there were these 4 threads, and as I wrote, because I don't make outlines before I write, I just found a way that these could be braided together. And as I say, some of it you just have to have a certain amount of faith. Will this work? Well, the only way to know is to keep writing. And and at a certain point, it did feel to me that those very different parts of life and experience, that they could make one story. And it's really the narrator. I would say it's more the narrator than the dog that holds it together.
Mm, mm. And moving a bit more, one of the things that going back to Edna O'Brien, and even going back to your own mentor Elizabeth Hardwick, you quote her as saying, thinking of literature as a calling, as a sort of sacred matter that you're called to, and there's even discussions with the student in the novel. The narrator talks to their students about that idea. I wonder, do you have that idea? Do you think of writing as a calling? Do you think of it like Edna O'Brien thought of it? Do you think, or what's your approach to writing? Why do you do it?
Well, I do think of it as a vocation. Now, one of the things about Susan Sontag was that she would always say that you have to think about your writing as a vocation, not as a career. And Edna O'Brien, it said, I think of my writing as a vocation, almost as a religious vocation, the way, as a nun or a priest would. And Susan felt the same way. I mean, to Susan, it was a heroic occupation. The best thing you could do with your life. Natalia Ginsburg felt the same way. It was the best profession that anyone could have. There's a very, very exalted idea of it, but the and what was Rilke's quote was, you have to ask yourself, in the dark of the night, you have to put the question to yourself, if I couldn't write, would I die? So I mean, I feel that in all the teaching that I've had, this was very much encouraged to have this idea of the seriousness of the work and to treat it like a vocation. So yes, I would say that I do feel that way about it.
Mm-hmm. It does seem to be, in a way, the only way to feel about it. And there's been lots of talk about the death of the novel, hasn't there? And there's an interview. I watched an interview with you where you were saying that writers are like cockroaches, in that they always survive. Can you say a little bit more about that? The novel has been, people have been saying it's been dead for a long time, and it seems to be pretty well, and it seems to be alive and kicking. Have you got any thoughts about that?
Well, I think one of the reasons, I mean, the main reason why it's still alive and kicking is because writers keep playing with the form and changing the form and changing the definition of what a novel is. So yes, you're right, though. People have talked about the death of the novel forever. But I think, that, people enjoy novels there's something about, I think of it more as storytelling, what you were saying when you quoted Auden. I mean, the main purpose of storytelling, as with poetry, is to help us understand ourselves and the world around us. And so, whether it's it depends on what kind of novel it is. For some people, a traditional novel is what's going to do that for the reader. And for other people, for other writers, they feel, readers and writers, they feel that this kind of novel isn't adequate to talk about contemporary life anymore. We need a different form. We need a different kind of novel, autofiction or documentary fiction. So the form keeps changing, but people keep writing these works of fiction or hybrid fiction. And as long as people are writing out, I think they'll be writing what can be called a novel, and people will want to read them.
Mm. And whilst you're on that, you've got a new novel, haven't you, coming out in September in the States and October in the UK?
Yes, I do.
What's it? Is there a title?
It's called "What Are You Going Through?"
We'll look forward to that. So thank you very, very much, Sigrid. Really, really lovely to meet you. As I said, when I read The Friend, I really did feel like you were a friend to me, and that the novel just gave me so much. Yeah, gave me so much, so much pleasure. After all, the novel reading for me is to do with pleasure. So much pleasure, but also so much meaning unified with that. It's not mere pleasure, but pleasure unified with meaning. So do buy Sigrid's novel. You can, normally what we'd be doing at PoetryEast at this moment is I'd be saying from here, oh, well, Sigrid has agreed to sign at the end of the interview. She'll be signing out. So I do buy a novel, do buy some of the other novels, Salvation. These are just a few that I've got. We can't do that, of course, now, but you can buy them. Lots of bookstores or bookshops are doing their own online way of buying books now. And of course, you can buy it through Amazon and all sorts of other sellers. But I'd really recommend the book. I'd recommend the book, The Friend, as good company, to be a friend to you. These are difficult times. We were talking, weren't we, Sigrid, on the phone about the situation in New York and the situation in London. And these are difficult times, and they're good times to read a novel. So many of us now are more and more being drawn to the screen and drawn to YouTube, like this is on YouTube. But it's a wonderful time to read a novel. So I'd very much recommend that you read Sigrid Nunez, The Friend. You won't regret it. I've been recommending it to all of my friends. I even sent a copy of it to my elderly mother, who's already started reading it. So just to say thank you very much indeed, Sigrid. Very, very nice to meet you. I'm sorry that we couldn't do the interview at the London Buddhist Centre.
Thank you so much. It's delightful to be here.
Well, I hope one day I'll actually meet you in person rather than on the screen.
Yes, I hope that happens, and I hope it's not too far in the future.
Yes, indeed.
Meanwhile, take care.
And you, and the best for the new novel. And I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.